How many times have we talked about the diversity of life? Well, we still have to talk about it one more time, okay? Life is diverse. We've covered that over and over and over. According, and many of the things we're going to say in this video is assuming the theory of evolution is right, and I think by now you get an idea that I have some issues with that. But if the theory of evolution is right, the bee and the flower, they're very different, but they're related very distantly. It's been a long time since plants separated from animals, but some people will tell you that yes, they are related. And this is what we're going to try to discuss in this video. Because there's so much diversity, we need some way of organizing things. Okay? There's nothing that the scientist likes more than classifying things and everything is pigeonholed in the correct place. Okay? So phylogeny is the evolutionary history and relationship between species so you can classify them. The study of organisms with the whole purpose of deriving the relationships so you can classify them is called systematics. And then how different organisms are related, they are shown through a phylogenetic tree. I think I have an example. Yes. This is saying, okay, you began with an original ancestor that branches into the three domains of life that we saw, archaea, bacteria, eukarya, and then each one keeps branching and branching and branching. And here, and the animals, that's where you are. Okay? So you see, it looks kind of like a tree. You have a stem that keeps branching and all that. So that's a phylogenetic tree. How do we classify? This will be a review from the first video. The science of naming and grouping species called taxonomy. We use a Linnaean system that divides organisms into three domains. We already talked about that: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Each domain contains several kingdoms, and we did look at the kingdoms for eukarya, remember? Within kingdoms, then remember you classify into phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. We did talk about that. For those of you who didn't see the original video, I gave a mnemonic: dear King Philip came over for good soup. As a way to remember: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay? The group at each level is going to call a taxon. Okay? So a genus is a taxon, family is taxon, there are taxons. And remember, we talk about organisms are going to be named by the binomial nomenclature that represents the genus and the species. And you're going to have to go back to that video. I don't want to go through all of that again. But common names are not specific enough. Common names vary with different languages. So we need a proper scientific name, and that's what the binomial is. And it's called binomial because it's two words, genus and species. Notice that as you go from the domain all the way to species, the organisms become more and more similar. Okay? So you're looking at a dog, and you say, well, if you look at the domain, we're looking at eukaryotes. Well, you can have in eukaryotes flowers, you can have insects, you can have fungi, you can have so many different things. They're all very different. But we're going to go up to the kingdom, and we limit to animals. So we eliminate the fungi, we eliminate the plants, but still a ladybug and the dog don't look very similar. Okay, phylum is going to be chordata. Those are vertebrates. So we eliminate the ladybug, we eliminate a few things, but there's still a fish and a dog don't look very similar. The next group, mammalia, mammals. That eliminates fish and birds, but still the rabbit and the dog, okay. Order, carnivores, so that eliminates anything that doesn't eat other animals. Still, a dog and a cat, they're not very similar, so you go into the family, Canidae, those are dogs, but that includes the wolves, the jackal, foxes, and all of that. Genus, Canis, these are directly related to the dog. So you have the jackal, the wolf, and then when you go to the species, actually Canis lupus can be the wolf or the dog, because the dog is supposed to have evolved from wolves that became domesticated. These are animals that like to live in groups and they attach themselves to humans. So the domestic dog is a subspecies. Obviously, I don't expect you to memorize all of this. We'll talk a little bit more about classification in the second semester. But I want you to understand that as you go down these sublevels, the diversity decreases. Look at the diversity at the first level, but the similarities increase. That's all I want to cover for today. Okay? So here you have a phylogenetic tree. It reflects the evolutionary relationships. Again, you're assuming that all animals are related. In that you have in here the big apes in here and how they're supposed to come. How did they do that? They look at physiological characteristics. Now they're looking at DNA. They're looking at proteins. Notice that in some places the tree splits. We call it the branch point. When you have a branch that begins with only one organism there, that's called a rooted tree. And when you have two branches coming up from one spot, those are called sister taxa. So for instance, in this case, this orangutan from Sumatra and the Borneo, they are sister taxa because they come from the same group, but the chimpanzee is completely separate because they don't come from the same branch point. This is another example of phylogenetic tree is rooted on having an organism without a vertebral column, or they're asking you, does it have a vertebral column or not? So if it has a vertebral column, they continue asking questions. Does it have a hinge jaw? Because that separates lampreys from the real fish. Well, does it have legs? No, the fish don't have legs, but have animals with legs. Does the egg have an amnion? We are going to cover all of that in the second semester. This is just an example in here. So you can separate the frogs from the organisms that have hair. When you separate the mammals from the lizards. So notice that what you're doing is branching, and you could be doing the same thing on every one of these. We talked about homologous structures before. We say features that are similar morphologically and genetically. We call them homologous structures, and according to the theory of evolution, it means because they come from common evolutionary parts, they have a common ancestor. But we did see, when we talk about evolution, that sometimes you have structures that are similar because they just happen to be adapted to a similar environment, but there is no evolutionary common ancestor, and we call those ones analogous structures. Okay? We talk about all of that in the evolution chapter if you need to review it. They give you an example of homologous structures, the wings of a bat, of a bird, the leg of a horse, the flip of a whale, and they say, hey, they're homologous because they all have the same parent. Remember, we said one bone, then two bones, and a bunch of little bones. You follow the same parent, all of them, and they say, oh, they have a common ancestor. Like so, we also said it could be that have a similar function. They all have to do with movement. But like I said, this chapter is based on accepting evolution. Even evolution will tell you, be careful with misleading appearances. Sometimes you have organisms that we know they're very closely related, but they look different. And say, look at the skull of the chimpanzee and the human. They're very different. But we know, or we want to believe, that chimpanzees and humans are very closely related. So we just continue, sometimes appearances will deceive you. That's easier than say, maybe we're wrong and we're not related, okay? Analogous structures, on the other hand, they say that these are organisms that are phylogenetically unrelated, like a bat and a bird and all that, but because they're adapted to the same environment, in this case the air, flying through the air, they all develop similarly. So how do you build phylogenetic tree? The method of constructing it is called cladistics. And this is, if you ever have questions about evolution, this will settle. You classify organisms into clades. And you call a clade a group of organisms that closely relate to each other and to the ancestor. Okay, don't forget, and to the ancestor from which they're descending. And they assume three things: that all living things are related to a common ancestor, that whenever speciation takes place, they always split into two, they never split into three or four. Okay, but eventually there's enough changes that you can consider to be different species, calling different states in here. The funny thing is that there is no rules about what characteristics you're going to look at. It's like you choose your own. Okay, and it gets even worse. Don't worry. So you decide you're going to classify based on certain characteristics. If you find it in all of the members of the group, including the ancestor, you call that a shared ancestral character. But if only some of them have it, then you call it shared derived character. And you say, wait a minute. We are classifying them by a characteristic that we said in the previous slide is common to all of the members of the group and to the ancestor. And now you're saying that some don't have it? I think I've told you before, don't try to tell these people that they don't make sense. Don't try to tell them they're contradicting each other. Because they'll tell you you're a fanatic, you're crazy, you're whatever. And then they say that the best trees are chosen by maximum parsimony, meaning events occur in the simplest, most obvious way. Basically, if to go from organism A to organism B, you can do it in 3 steps, or you can do it 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. We will choose the simplest way. That's what maximum parsimony means. Okay? Again, if evolution is true, is that necessarily the best way? I don't know. So here I'm just showing you, and the same, this particular tree is made with clades. This clade, the amniota, they have amniotic egg. We're going to study that, like I say, in the second one, but this is an egg that allows for reproduction outside the world. We're just going to leave it like that. So lizards, rabbits, humans, they all belong to that clade. But animals that live in the world don't. Another clade could be vertebrates, because anything that has a backbone is a vertebrate. Again, you choose the characteristic that you want, and like I said, sometimes there will be examples that don't have the characteristic, and you say, who cares? Who knows? I realize this is just a bunch of definitions, but still, if you want to go over it again slowly, or if you have comments, I really appreciate comments, but you can go to my Washington account and we'll meet. I'd be glad to discuss anything that has to do with reviewing evolution. You'll make my day. So remember, the video description has a link to my Washington account.